I remember an American bishop telling me this story to kind of illustrate this. He was talking about an experience of going to a parish to celebrate confirmation. And after he finished the confirmation, you know, there's a reception in the parish hall, and he's there visiting with people in the hall. And this precocious little girl comes up to him, you know, not at all intimidated by him. And she says, I know who you are. He said, really? Who am I? And she points, because there's a picture of him in the wall of the hall. He says, that's you. Your father's boss. She said, and father's Sister Mary Ellen's boss. And then she gets this mischievous look on her face, and she points to the portrait of the Pope. She says, but he's your boss. Of course, ecclesiologically, she's dead wrong. Of course, ecclesiologically, the Second Vatican Council made it very clear that that's in fact not how the churches work. That's how a lot of us Catholics thought of it. We thought that Sister Mary Ellen reports to Father, Father reports to the Bishop reports to the Pope. But in fact, the Second Vatican Council said, for example, the Bishop is not a delegate of the Pope. He's not a vicar of the Pope. He does not receive his power from the Pope. He is, in fact, the vicar of Christ. Every bishop, according to Catholic doctrine, is a bishop of Christ. He gets his power through the sacrament of ordination from Christ. He's not a delegate of the Pope. He's the ordinary pastor of that church. Right? And yet, in the Catholic imaginations of many people, even today, we still think this way. We still have a military chain of command conception of things. Right? And so the council comes along and it says, no. There was a more ancient way of understanding our church that continues to believe in the necessity of the Pope and the necessity of the bishops and the priests and all of the church. But there was a different vision. And it was a vision governed by communion. And I'm going to explore that in just a moment. But I need to point out that because this vision of the church became so dominant, during the Reformation there was, I think, an understandable reaction against this universalist ecclesiology. And though this is a gross simplification, I would never suggest all of Protestantism falls prey to this. There are strands of Protestantism that reacted to this universalist ecclesiology by constructing what we often call a congregationalist spirituality. Right? If in their mind Roman Catholicism saw the church as this vast universal corporation, then the alternative must be focusing on the local church, the congregation. And there is a strand in at least American Protestantism that focuses very much on what's going on in the life of the church, meaning the congregation, but has very little sense of their spiritual and formal bonds to other churches. Does that follow? And so if one danger is this universalist ecclesiology that thinks of the church as this universal superstructure, this monolithic reality, then the alternative is a kind of congregational ecclesiology. Now, though that congregationalism was developed as a reaction to Catholicism, I would argue that we find elements of that congregational mentality in the Catholic Church today, right? That is to say, for many of us, we pay lip service to our belonging to the diocese, but for many of us, our identity is firmly rooted in the parish, and sometimes almost exclusively in the parish, right? We resent diocesan appeals. We resent, well, probably not in this diocese, but in some U.S. diocese, we resent these kinds of things, right? And we reckon, there's, in other words, this de facto congregationalism where all that matters is that what matters are among the people that we know. Right? Now, why is this a dangerous thing? Well, I think it's dangerous because in our contemporary situation, one of the cultural factors that shapes us is a kind of new tribalism, to use the language of Václav Havel. A new tribalism. That there's a tendency for us, because of our increased mobility, because of our global communication systems, it's much easier for us to surround ourselves with people who think like we do, right? There's a sociologist in the United States and a journalist who authored a very influential book called The Big Sort. The Big Sort. And what they were doing, he was primarily interested in political demographics in the United States. They went back and they looked at every one of our presidential campaigns going back to 1960. And then what they did is they looked at individual voting districts, right? And what they were interested in was the partisan voting patterns within a voting district. And what they discovered is that in the, let's say, the election of 1960, in any given district, the majority might have been something like 52-48. Does that make sense? Right. And sometimes it'd be 52-48 Republican, and sometimes it'd be 53-47 Democrat or something like that. There were a few exceptions. But as they tracked presidential elections from 1960 to the present, they found the partisanship increasing. Within districts, it would then become 55-45, 60-40, even 65-35. That is, what was happening was what they called the big sort. People were not consciously, nobody was, saying, hey, do you vote Republican or Democrat? Nobody was consciously doing that. But there was this basic resorting of Americans where they were just finding themselves drawn to neighborhoods and places where people kind of thought about things the way they did. Now, you might think, of course, that internet technologies would work away from this, right? That now you have this unprecedented opportunity to encounter people from all parts of the globe who think in dramatically different ways. But in point of fact, the internet tends to work just the opposite for us. What it really does is make it easier than ever for us to find people who think like us, and to go to those websites, and to read those magazines, and to buy those people's books, right? Now, the internet can be used in other ways, and I want to emphasize, I think there's some very promising attempts at kind of pushing back against this. But the overwhelming cultural movement in the Western world, I think, is this big sort. It becomes easier for us to find people who look like us and think like us. We even find this, at least in the U.S., in Catholic parishes. I don't know how much this is the case here in Canada, but in many dioceses in the United States, parish territorial boundaries mean very little. People shop for a parish that celebrates the liturgy in ways they're comfortable, has religious education in ways they're comfortable, has liturgical music that fits their own particular interests. And again, to some extent, I'm not sure that's a bad thing. One could interpret that as people being more adult, more proactive in the living out of their faith. But there's also a tendency, right, that once again what we're doing is we're sorting ourselves out. We're going to surround ourselves with people who think and look the way we do. This is why it's never been more important than it is today for our church to recover an ecclesiology of communion. Particularly to recover the Catholicity of communion. The recognition that communion is not about the gathering of like to like. It is coming together based on the unity of baptism and faith, in confidence that through the power of the Spirit, we may come to learn from those who initially seem unlike us, those who may initially seem even unpleasant to us. One of my favorite spiritual writers is a Quaker writer, Parker Palmer. And Parker Palmer has this wonderful definition of community that I like. He says, community is the recognition that we always end up sitting next to the person we least like. And we resign ourselves to the fact that when they get up and leave, someone even more distasteful will take their place. Now I would argue now we're getting a little closer to a Catholic notion of communion, right? Which is not just a tribalism where we find everybody that tells us how wonderful and smart and insightful and spiritual we are, but where we come to recognize the challenges that come when we encounter people who in fact are different from us. This is why when we try and diagram an alternative to this, what we come up with is something that looks a little more like this. This is not congregationalism. This is not each congregation on its own doing its own thing, but neither is it that pyramidal reality. This is the church as a communion of communions, in which each church has its own integrity, but always lives in communion with ever larger circles. So one could imagine this in terms of, at multiple levels. One could think of a diocese, in which this diagram is all one diocese, and the larger circle in the center is the bishop, who is the servant of the communion of the churches. And each parish is constituted even within the parish by small faith communities, intentional communities, like the ones that you're contemplating in your renewal program, or different ethnic communities, or different age demographics, right? And the challenge then is for none of them to become self-contained, but to always stay in relation. And of course then at the larger level we can think of each of these as a diocese, and the Diocese of Rome in the center, with the Bishop of Rome as himself the servant of the life of faith and communion in the church. Here we recognize that what Catholicity in communion calls us to, at every level of church life, is a gift exchange. That at its heart, Catholicity is a gift exchange. It is not tolerance of difference. It is not tolerance of difference. This is a difficulty. I lived for 10 years in a wonderful local church, the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston, which was very ethnically diverse. Very ethnically diverse. We had not just Hispanic communities, we had all sorts of Latin American communities, we had Vietnamese Catholics, we had Filipino Catholics, we had a significant number of immigrants from various countries in Africa and so on. It's a very rich church, and sometimes you would hear pastors with some pride talking about a parish that is culturally diverse, in which Mass might be celebrated in 3 languages. We had a number of parishes, for example, that Mass would be celebrated in English, in Spanish, and Vietnamese. But if you looked at the parishes closely, what you saw was not a Catholic parish. What you saw is a parish with 3 independent parishes within it that didn't engage with one another. Now what happened was the parishioners recognized the rights of the Vietnamese Catholics to celebrate the Mass in Vietnamese and to have their own catechesis, right? They recognized this as toleration. They tolerated that, but they didn't think they had any need to engage the Vietnamese Catholics or the Mexican American Catholics. You see the difference? It's one thing for me to say, well, it's great that the Hispanic community has their own liturgy and so on and so forth. But if I don't recognize that my faith is impoverished unless I'm engaging them, I'm at tolerance, but I'm not at Catholicity yet.